you for this Friday webinar series. And I'm so happy to mention that our think tank, EGROW Foundation, which we started in October 2018, has been successfully able to do more than 220 webinars, which we started around COVID. The think tank aims to provide research-based policy advice to the government and to anybody who is seeking research support from us. We have been very, very fortunate in the 5 years that we have been here. We have done good research projects, good number of research projects for the government, for NITI Aayog, for UNSCAP, and other entities. We have really enjoyed the research, and we have also contributed significantly into policy making. Very proud to mention that as a think tank under the G20 presidency of India, we were also able to contribute. We were able to do a series of 11 webinars on new international economic order. We did 6 on women empowerment, and we did about 5 on climate. And we want to do more on women empowerment and on climate. But the lineup of webinars as such, we have not been able to find a day to or a date to deliver the remaining 5 for climate and remaining 4 for women. We wanted to do 10 each. We have been also very fortunate on this platform. We have had 3 Nobel laureates to come and speak to us. And I'm sure many more who have spoken to us, some of them on the cutting edge, are potential Nobel laureates. The blend of speakers that we have had Indians in India, we have Indians working abroad, and we had foreigners come on this platform, the complete beautiful blend to talk about contemporary economic issues that the world and India was struggling with. It is in this very context I met Karthik at the conference in Delhi. Knowing his research, I requested him, and you know the book that he has come out with. It's actually a magnum opus of what can be done, how to accelerate India's development. And he has spoken so elegantly, given his vast experience and in-depth analysis, given so elegantly practical solutions that we can usher in. EGROW has been working on India at 2047, India at 2050. India at 2047, we did a project for NITI at their behest. So most of the material that we did is sitting with NITI, and rightfully, they have the intellectual property right on it. But on our website, you will find some glimpses of it. And you will find India 2050 type of working papers, and we are going to come out more with those thought-provoking working papers. So when this book came out, Accelerating India's Development, it was obvious that we request Karthik, and we are so happy he accepted our request. And as you know, he's exactly on the opposite side of the planet. Exactly. So time has been a major challenge, and today also you notice that he is sitting in the lobby so that his family can take rest. It's early morning up there. Let me formally introduce my friend Karthik. I've known him from 2003 when he was at Harvard and I was doing my postdoctoral studies. He was doing his PhD. And I've known and watched his progress from 2003 onwards. His PhD seminar, which he gave at the Kennedy School, I attended it. He was very, very rigorous in his research and a very popular scholar in Harvard. Karthik is right now the Tata Chancellor's Professor of Economics at the University of California, San Diego. Born and raised in India, he has earned a bachelor's degree, and I tell you, it's a dream what Karthik has achieved. He did his bachelor's degree in economics from Harvard, and MPhil in economics from Cambridge, and back to Harvard to do his PhD in economics. That's when I met him, when he was there. His research spans development, public and labor economics with a focus on improving the effectiveness of public spending in the social sector, education, health, social protection programs. His research program is characterized by large-scale randomized experiments conducted in partnership with governments to study the impact of programs and policies at scale. His research has been published extensively in the best journals of our economics profession: American Economic Review, Quarterly Journal of Economics, Journal of Political Economy, and also being featured in global media outlets including New York Times, Wall Street, Financial Times, and The Economist, in addition to several leading Indian newspapers. He is a research associate of the NBR, on the board of directors of the Poverty Action Lab at MIT, where he is co-chair of the Education Research Program and a fellow and board member of the Bureau of Economic Analysis of Development. He's actively involved in policy advising and capacity building in India, and he deserves, you will see in his presentation, and if you get a chance to read his book, very, very extensive and in-depth analysis. Both at the central and state government level, he is involved in capacity building and policy advice, and he writes a column on economic policy for the Hindustan Times and teaches a popular course on the Indian economy at UCSC. I'll not be surprised, and I would say he's one of the few Indians whom I read. And please remember, he is working with the Nobel laureates at the Poverty Action Lab at MIT. And his own guide, Michael Kramer, is a Nobel laureate. So when I say that there are many potential Nobel laureates who have made their presentation here, Karthik, amongst the few Indians that I know who are on the cutting edge, command respect in the profession, and work very hard, Karthik is amongst that small group of leading economists in the world. It's our privilege and honor to have Karthik come and speak to us today. And I hope there'll be many more occasions when we'll invite him and he'll have time. And today we are requesting him to introduce his book to us and share his thoughts with us. Karthik, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that incredibly warm introduction. Am I clearly audible, and are my slides being shown?
Yes, both.
Yes.
Wonderful. Wonderful. So it's an absolute pleasure to do this. Again, I've known Charanji for a long time. I've known Arvindji, and it's an absolute pleasure. So I think let's get started. There is a lot in this book, and I will barely be able to sketch a very high level argument. But so where are we? Hang on, let me make sure. Yeah, okay. So when we think about where India is today, okay, in many ways, we have a lot to be proud of, okay? So in the global landscape, the Indian economy is one of the fastest growing large economies. We have macro stability. We've never defaulted. The sheer size of India, the demographics in terms of the youthful population, the democracy, and the globally prominent and successful diaspora all combined together to kind of really give India prominence in the world economy right now. At the same time, we also face profound challenges, especially on basic service delivery for all Indians. So if you look at just essential services like education, health, public safety, justice, welfare, and jobs, we have a long, long way to go before we can meet the aspirations of our people. So in education, for example, we spend over 7.5 lakh crores every year, around 3% of GDP, but you still have almost 50% of children in rural India are completing primary school, completing 5 years of schooling without being able to even read at a second standard level. In health, you have 35% of children being stunted, and this permanently impairs the long-term economic potential potential and prospects of these children. Public safety is a substantial challenge, not just intrinsically, but also for the economy because it deters female labor force participation. Justice, we have a backlog of over 30 million cases. And as we will see, this is again, not just an issue of individual welfare and rights, it's also a fundamental challenge to the economy, because over 60 to 70% of the cases in the courts are often to do with land or capital or credit. And so, which means that while these disputes are underway, these productive factors of production cannot be deployed for economic activity. And then, everybody talks about the jobs problem, but the problem is nobody seems to know what to do about it. So these are really wicked, wicked problems. Okay. So when we think about the overall story of the Indian economy and how can we do better, as one simple way to describe the Indian economy is that we have a top 10%, okay, that drives growth. And the top 10% includes a top 1% who are in globally competitive jobs and entrepreneur leaders. You have another 9% with salary jobs. And as you know, many studies show, it's really people with steady salaries, right? Like, I mean, who provide predictable demand. And then you have 30 to 40% in service sector jobs who are essentially kind of supporting the demand created by the top 10%. And so these are a lot of the informal jobs that we see in urban areas. And then you've got a remaining 50% that is mainly left out and primarily in rural areas and supported by welfare programs. And so both the political and the pragmatic kind of push for different kinds of welfare programs comes from this being the main way of including the bottom 50% in the process of India's economic growth. Now, at one level, this is not just my characterization, right? If you can look at summaries by venture capitalists like Sajid Pai, who write reports on kind of characterizing the Indian economy, this is broadly what people who are investing will also tell you. Okay. Now, at one level, this model has worked reasonably well. Okay. So before we beat ourselves too much, this is a model that has served us well by kind of creating a world-leading IT sector, world-leading pharma sector in kind of high skills intensive manufacturing. So, we still have a lot to be proud of. But the problem is that we cannot function at full potential, right? I mean, without firing on all engines. And so that's why, the book is called Accelerating India's Development. And as we'll see throughout this talk, India is average or above average on many measures. But to get to full potential, you can't do that if 50% of your population is left out, through a lack of education and skills or through being, malnourished and not being able to contribute. Okay. So the challenge, therefore, is not everybody understands this. The problem is, how should we do this? Okay. And so better human development, we don't lack policy documents, correct? We have policy documents. I've worked both with Planning Commission and with Niti Aayog, and regardless of government, regardless of the people, leading these institutions, there is just a broad consensus that we need to do this, okay? The challenge is not the intention. The challenge is really the effectiveness of the Indian state and the government in delivering essential public services and translating our policy goals into actual reality. Okay, so and this is one way to see this is there's this very nice summary by Rakesh Mohan in 2018 who wrote this paper summarizing 25 years of Indian economic reforms. And he notes here that the way forward for accelerated growth in India is being held back by major governance deficits in all areas connected with the delivery of public goods and services. Okay, and then Professor Lan Pritchard, who's always a bit more dramatic, right? But he has this, he has this very powerful and simple saying where he says, the weak performance of the Indian state is one of the 10 greatest challenges facing humanity. And he says this partly based on the size of the problem and partly on the number of people who are affected. Now, in fact, in the past 10, 15 years, particularly through Aadhaar and DBT, we have seen substantial improvements in kind of state effectiveness. But, effectively what we've managed to successfully do is we've done well in areas where you have managed to bypass and disintermediate kind of local intermediaries and go directly to the beneficiary. But where we have not solved the problem is when it comes to human intermediated services, right? So education, health, police, courts, these are all things that actually require humans at the front line to deliver better services. And you can't just bypass them. And that requires a completely different approach to imagining how we're going to improve effectiveness. And that is, what this book is fundamentally about. Okay. So as we assess India at 75, there's really no greater barrier to achieving full potential for citizens than improving the effectiveness of the Indian state. Now, why did I decide to write this book after 20 years of research on different aspects of service delivery? See, as many of you may know, academic economists these days, we don't write books, we write peer-reviewed papers that then, get published in journals. But, books are kind of things that we don't normally do. So why have I done this? And it is basically because the unifying thread across my work over 20 years has been that whether I'm working in education or in health or in welfare or in child development, you see that sector after sector after sector, the common pattern that emerges is the centrality of investing in governance and state effectiveness. Okay. And the main point here is that improving human development is not just a matter of spending more money in the social sector in a government as usual way. Okay. So, and this is really the main point of departure in the book, because often the default approach to saying we need to improve education or improve health is saying we need to increase the budget. Okay. But the real issue is not about increasing spending by itself, but it's really about improving the effectiveness of public spending. Okay. And as I'll show you later, like, this idea of saying that we will need to increase the budget simply doesn't work because we often just don't have the money. Okay. So when you don't have the money, you can't kind of put up your hands and saying, I can't deliver because I don't have the money. You have to start getting innovative about improving the effectiveness of public spending. Now, what kind of a dominant pattern of my work, like I said, is that the social return on investment to investing in governance and state effectiveness are often 10 times greater, okay, than simply spending more in a government as usual way. And in fact, there's a government colleague, I used to say business as usual way, who suggested the term government as usual. Okay. So let me just give you a couple of examples. And so the book will highlight a lot more of this. Okay. So education is where I've done most of my work. And as Charanji suggested, I'm just mentioning the journals and where these are published so that you'll know that everything I'm talking about is based on incredibly detailed peer-reviewed research papers that have been published in world-leading journals, where we've spent, literally 6 to 10 years on each of these papers. Okay. Uh, so, for example, in education, where does most of our money go? Okay, most of the money goes to kind of teacher salaries and the unconditional increases that happen as part of the various pay commissions. Okay. But what study after study shows is that even large unconditional increases in pay have almost no impact on outcomes. Okay. Whereas even modest amounts of performance linked pay, it could be even 3 to 5%, right? Has a huge positive impact. Okay. So simply being able to change the structure of public sector compensation from having even a modest amount of performance linkage can be transformative in terms of effectiveness of the Indian state. Okay. I'll give you another example from NREGA, where we did this large-scale randomized evaluation in the unified state of Andhra Pradesh. Where we tested the impact of biometric smart cards in reducing leakage in NREGA. And again, what we estimate is that it was 10 times, the return on investment was over 10 times because the leakage reduction was about 9 times the cost of the intervention. And the time saving to the poor was kind of over the cost of the intervention. So put together, that was 10 times more. And then similarly, we have this recent paper that came out. So that paper was in the American Economic Review in 2016. And then we had this other paper in Econometrica last year that looked at the overall labor market effects of improving NREGA. And the interesting thing we find is that the effects of improving NREGA implementation through kind of better use of technology and reducing leakage was almost as big as on market wages as the program rollout itself. Okay. And so and we see this now in education where we spend so much money hiring teachers, but teacher absence rates are about 25%. And so improving supervision will be about 10 times more cost effective than hiring more teachers. But almost 40 to 50% of supervisory positions are vacant in many places. Child development. This is a paper that just came out earlier this month in the Journal of Political Economy, where we study in a large-scale study in Tamil Nadu, looking at the impact of putting an extra Anganwadi worker focused on early childhood education. And you see that this extra worker was significantly improved learning outcomes, but also led to a significant reduction in child malnutrition because you were freeing up the time of the existing worker to focus more on nutrition. Okay. And because this worker is locally hired and is therefore much more accountable, you see that the return on investment we estimate based on long-term projections of improved labor market outcomes from early childhood development is we estimate that the return on investment is about 12 to 20 times the cost. Okay. Again, in contrast, where does most of our money go? Most of the money goes to unconditional salary increases for the incumbents, and therefore we don't hire more, but that ends up having no effect. Okay. we had this other study on farmer welfare in Telangana, where we kind of tested the impact of an outbound call center to farmers, where this was in the context of the Raitu Bandhu scheme. Where the government was, it was a massive high profile program. And so what we did was we had this outbound call center that was calling 25,000 farmers and just measuring and asking, have you received your benefits? Did they come on time? Did you have to pay any bribe? Were you able to cash your check? And what we did was we randomly selected 25% of the mandal, which is like the block agriculture officers, and we told them that your performance is being measured by directly talking to the beneficiaries. Okay, and simply having that data and visibility and better monitoring and measurement led to a significant 25x increase in the so, I mean, it was only 1.5% increase in terms of money delivered, but relative to the cost of the call center, it was 25x more money delivered and 100x more money delivered on time. Okay. And then there's this another very, very nice paper that recently came out by a Berkeley PhD student who was a postdoctoral fellow with me. So this is Manaswini Rao, and her dissertation shows that the district judicial court vacancies, like, that when you manage to fill a district court vacancy, she uses the transfers and judges to look at the impact of adding capacity, that each district court judge clears another 200 cases a year. And because a lot of these cases are economic cases, that the clearing of the credit and land cases led to a significant improvement in total credit offtake and total economic activity. And she estimates that the return in economic activity is about 30 times higher than the cost of the judge. Okay. So the larger point in all of this is you see that this pattern of 10x ROI, right, shows up again and again. And the reason this is not so obvious is that most of our policy discourse, we focus on the budget allocation. Okay, where should we allocate to infrastructure? Should we allocate to social sector? Should we allocate to health or education? Where should we allocate the money? But we spend remarkably little money effort thinking about the translation of that money into impact. Okay, and what 20 years of my research has been about is kind of doing field-based work to understand how programs are working and connecting that back with kind of the outlays. And that's why we see the centrality of kind of investing in the quality of expenditure. And to do that, you're going to have to open up the black box of the Indian state, right? Because effectively the government or the state is this machinery where you put some money on the top and some output comes. But is chakravyuh ke andar kya hota hai? Like, I mean, then requires us to open up the black box of the state. And so, there's this nice quote from Devesh Kapoor, who says this is the second quote here, right? That India's experience highlights the importance of studying the state as an organization and not just as an institution. And then this is a paper by Rohini Pandey, which says, we argue for research that unpacks the state. We believe that micro level evidence can inform system level reforms, but to do so effectively requires engaging with the political economy of reform. Okay, so in a way, the book both of these papers, are about 5-6 years old. And, what the book is doing is actually responding to this call, right? So I've given you example of these micro studies, and now we're seeing how we're going to put that together to kind of inform a strategy for system level reforms that can help to accelerate India's development. Okay. So the book is 18 chapters, and in fact, maybe it is not a coincidence because it is literally like a Mahabharata, and the Mahabharata has 18 chapters. So I didn't plan it that way, but I was happy it ended up that way. Okay. And so the core of the book is actually section 2 and 3, right? Which is, and so it's really the book is in two halves, where the first half is how do you build an effective Indian state, and the second half is then how do you use that to accelerate India's development. Okay. But a lot of economists often we discuss economic policy and reforms without understanding or discussing the political and bureaucratic constraints. And so, which is why before I start getting into the core of the book, there is this key section in the beginning on the key actors. So the intro chapter on the imperative of state capacity is making this high-level argument that I just did, that the returns on investment here are going to be so large, and that this is the key binding constraint that as a country, this needs to be our top priority. Okay. Now, the question you may ask is, for a technocratic economist looking at the data, it might be a top priority, but is it a priority for the politicians and the bureaucrats? And so before I start telling you what to do, I need to convince you that this is something that even the leadership will want to do. Okay. And so one of the reasons for optimism, and the chapter 2 is a chapter I'm actually very proud of, because it kind of because I'm an economist and it required me to read extensively in the political science literature, to then place Indian democracy in global historical comparative perspective. Okay. And the one simple, so there are two key points I want to make over there, right? See, one is that if you look at the development of the nation state itself in most high income countries, it followed three phases, okay, of what I first call the security state, okay, where for most of human history, the only thing governments were doing was defense and law and order, okay. And then in the next phase, you get what I call the industrial state, where governments in the 19th century started investing in roads, railways, canals, sewage systems, and and that happens at the time of the Industrial Revolution, and that is what supports economic growth. And then it's only in the last 100 years that you get kind of the third phase of the state, which is the welfare state, okay? Because what happens in the phase of growth is that there's also massive increase in inequality. And the benefits of growth go mainly to people who own land, capital, and are highly educated, right? So physical capital, financial capital, human capital are the groups that benefit mostly from that growth process, at least in the short term. So the welfare state is a relatively modern phenomenon, okay? Now, the other important point to understand is that these three phases of the state are correlated with the amount of democracy you have, okay? So the security states typically have no democracy. The subtle point about the industrial state of the 19th century is that when the US and UK and countries like this like to say they were democracies, they're actually very, very flawed and limited democracies, okay? Because the voting rights were restricted to white property owning men, okay? And so why does this matter? Because in the long term, roads and infrastructure may benefit the poor, but in the short term, they benefit the people who own the property the most, okay? So that gives you the demographic kind of support that is going to support what the government is doing. And it's not an accident that the welfare state happens only after the expansion of the franchise, okay? That universal adult franchise is a relatively recent phenomenon even in the West, okay? And in any income distribution, if you're in the left of the median, you want more redistribution. If you're on the right, you want lower taxes, okay? So it's not an accident that the welfare state happens along with the expansion of voting rights, okay? Now, why am I giving you this history? It is because India is unique in human history, okay, as being the only large country that had universal adult democracy on day one of independence, okay? And so what that does to the nature of the Indian state is that it creates a lot more pressure for welfare and redistribution before we have developed the fiscal and the administrative capacity to do so, okay? And that's the key point, because welfare states are expensive to run, and most high income countries built welfare states after reaching middle income status, okay? So now, this is not to say that democracy was a mistake. It is democracy was a great moral triumph, okay? And one way to see the value of this moral triumph is that, the US, for example, does food stamps for the poor at a GDP per capita of about $18,000 in the mid 1930s, inflation adjusted to 2011. But India does PDS for the poor at a corresponding GDP per capita of about $1,000 to $1,200. Okay. So what that means is at 1/15th the GDP per capita of the US, India is doing universal food security. Similarly, India does midday meals and free lunches in schools at a much earlier stage than other countries. Okay. So this is the way in which this is a great moral triumph, okay, for that is being enabled by our democracy. But that also comes with two fundamental challenges, right? There is the first is the public finance challenge, okay, which is the tax to GDP ratio is much lower when you're poor. And so when you're allocating these funds, the problem is not the welfare. The problem is that you're doing the welfare spending before building the administrative capacity to do so effectively. And which means that the effectiveness of that welfare spending is much lower than it could be if you had not invested in the state. Okay. So the key point I'm making, therefore, is that we are in a situation where the scope of the state, in terms of what we try to do, has expanded much before the strength of the state to meet that. And what we need to bring back that balance is to reinvest in the capacity of the Indian state to deliver what its democratic aspirations are. Okay. And the good news at a political level is
Am I audible? Yeah, I think.
Yes, you are.
Yes, you are. Yes. Yeah, sorry. I think my phone lost audio. Hang on, just give me 1 second. Let me go back to. All right, here we are. Okay, yes. So let me come back, share this doc from here. Okay. Okay. Yeah. So the good news, so the reason to be optimistic is that, the data shows that the nature of Indian elections are changing so that sorry, let me just, because I lost the thread when I lost the thing. So one of the first problem that we faced, therefore, was the public finance challenge. The second is the political economy challenge, right? Which is because when the state does so effectively, what Indian democracy did was expand the capacity of citizens to make a claim on the state, okay? But before the state had the capacity to meet those claims. And so as a result, the nature of politics becomes what I call a politics of scarcity, right? Where every group is competing to see how can I direct the resources of the state towards my group, as opposed to kind of investing in broader public goods. And that is what gives us what is our well-known vote bank politics, correct? Like, where parties identify specific demographics that they are associated with. And so the competition, the nature of politics becomes one of how do I distribute the benefits of office to my group of voters as opposed to create broad-based public goods. Okay. So, but the good news for India today is what I argue in the book is that the data shows that, see, there's an old politics of kind of identity polarization, based on language, region, religion, caste, etc. And there is a new politics that is based on governance and service delivery. Okay. And what the data suggests increasingly is that the governance and service delivery matters for re-election prospects, which means that the politicians are also now increasingly interested in delivering better. And so, which is why my hope is that the book comes at a time when we can kind of support the broader political desire, right? Like, to deliver better services, and saying, how do you build an effective state that can allow you to do that? Okay. So these are two chapters that set the stage. And then similarly, this chapter called The Bureaucracy's Burden is that we often blame the bureaucracy for not being able to deliver effectively, but we haven't really looked at the deep systemic challenges that the bureaucracy faces and how we can't expect better services without actually building better systems. Okay, so let me jump now into kind of into kind of the technical core of the book. Okay, so one of the key contributions here is to unpack the black box of the state and saying, hello, can you hear me? Or yeah, or maybe, yeah, I guess, yeah, somebody else has their audio out. Okay, but
Requesting everybody, please silence your mics. Let's listen to Karthik uninterrupted. He's sitting in California. Early in the morning, he's talking to us. Let's just respect him, please. Yes, Karthik, please go ahead.
Yeah. So anyway, so yeah, maybe. So let's just go into kind of what it takes to kind of building an effective state. Okay, and the one of the key contributions of the book is to unpack the effectiveness of the state into kind of data, personnel, public finance expenditure, revenue, federalism and decentralization, and the state and the market. And these are 6 key building blocks. Okay, and what I'm going to show you now is just like one slide from each of these chapters to give you a sense of why these issues are so important. Okay, so here is the chapter on a figure on data. And it shows you that we've got such fundamental problems with regard to data quality in service delivery. So here is kind of from a study done by Professor Abhijit Singh, where this is the top line here is official data and learning outcomes in a large Indian state. Okay, and this is what you see is in the official data in Hindi and maths. Okay, there is no learning crisis because there is no child who's scoring less than 60%. Okay, but what the study does is it resamples, it does an independent data audit, okay, of retesting a bunch of the same students on the same questions within kind of 1 to 2 months of the original measurement. And what you see is, and this was done between November and Jan, is that the true learning levels are dramatically below what is reported in this official data. Okay, and so in the official data, nobody is scoring below 60%. In the independent audit, nobody is barely scoring above 65%. Okay, and in maths, the situation is even worse. Now, why does this happen? It happens partly because, like, everybody in the system is under pressure to show good data. Okay, but when you actually look at what's going on, the situation situation is much worse. And this is not just me. This has been borne out in many, many ethnographic studies of the Indian state. Okay. But the reason this is a foundational problem is that partly we have wasted 20 years in learning outcomes, okay, because of this denial of reality. Okay, so, and this is again completely non-partisan. It runs across governments, across states, across sectors. Okay, so, and from 2005, Pratham has been doing annual measurements of learning, okay, to show that children, there is a learning crisis. But in the official data, there wasn't. And which means that the government, even if officers will individually admit that there is a problem, and as a system, you are not able to react, because as a system, you say in the official data, things are fine. Okay, so data becomes a foundational investment. Then similarly, like, we've got issues in personnel management, okay, where when we think about weak state capacity, one core challenge that we don't appreciate enough is how understaffed the Indian government is. Okay, so we have probably the lowest number of per capita employees in across countries, which is about 16. Now, in Scandinavian countries with better welfare states, you have 10 times more public employees. But even in countries like the US and China, this is about 4 or 5 times higher. And the main reason for this, there are many reasons, but one key reason for this is that the public sector pay in India is among the highest in the world. Okay, now this is not true at the top end of the government. Okay, at the very top end, people, because of wage compression, people are underpaid relative to the market value. But for the very large number of jobs, okay, so here is some of my own data from a study in Andhra Pradesh, where in about 2010. 12, where you see that the average government school teacher salary is about 6 times higher, okay, than the average private school salary. And this is true in almost every entry level job. Okay, and so one of the reasons you have over 100 applicants for every government job. Now, one part of this is, yes, there aren't enough private sector jobs, but what the economics tells you is that it also reflects kind of the excessively generous terms of the government job. And the problem there is twofold, right? It's not only that it is making it difficult to hire staff. So the basic problem of state capacity in India is we pay too much and we hire too few. Okay, so because most of the budget goes for unconditional salary increases of incumbents, you end up not having money to hire adequate staff, which is why you're so dramatically understaffed. Okay, so but the problem is worse than that. The problem is that the structure of public sector labor markets is also a key contributor to unemployment. And that's because the government terms are so generous relative to the private sector. You have educated youth in their 20s who are spending year after year after year writing government entrance exams. And we're starting to see more public attention paid to this recently. So the problem is not the aspirant, because they are acting rationally. The problem is the system, that we have set it up in a way, right? That is kind of so that it contributes to this larger problem of unemployment. Okay, so a recent study in Tamil Nadu, I think, showed that 80% of unemployment of educated youth was explained by people sitting for the state civil service exams. Okay, so this lure of the government job has enormous downstream consequences and distortions in the economy, which I talk about further in the book. Okay. So then the next key pillar of the effectiveness of the government is public finance, right? So how are we spending our public money? And what I have in this chapter is a very simple 2x2 framework. In fact, the finance secretary, Dr. Somnathan, sent me a note, in fact, appreciating this, and this is there in his endorsement, right? It's a very, very simple picture, but it can be very powerful as a way of making sense of how to improve quality of expenditure, okay? Which is, we can think about public spending as either improving efficiency, right? I mean, you invest in things that improve productivity, or that these are welfare schemes and redistribution that improve equity, okay? Now, what happens is there are many spending items we have that are in region 2 that can improve efficiency but potentially hurt equity. Okay, so a good example of that would be moving to a uniform GST rate. Okay, that will improve efficiency of tax collection, but it hurts equity because it is regressive. Okay, conversely, you can have programs in region 4 that are welfare programs. Say even the PDS, okay, because the PDS clearly promotes equity, but it has a whole bunch of downstream inefficiencies, partly from the structure of procurement and structure of, of violating kind of law of one price. But reasonable people can disagree, okay, about how we should prioritize between region 2 and region 4. Okay, so if you're center right, you may prioritize the efficiency. If you're center left, you may prioritize the equity. Okay, and that's completely fine. But my point in the book is that we spend so much money on items that are actually in region 3, which are actually bad for equity and bad for efficiency, right? And so one of the Examples of this would be, say, like, free electricity for farmers, right? It is one of the worst policies we have because it is regressive. It mainly benefits the rich farmers. It is incredibly inefficient, both in terms of the cropping patterns as well as kind of the depletion of the groundwater table. And it creates other downstream environmental costs. Okay. So it is bad for equity and efficiency. Okay. So similarly, say, going to the old pension scheme. Okay. If we did that, that would be something, because again, government employees are in the top 5% of the demographic, and going to old pension scheme again it hurts equity, but it also hurts efficiency because it reduces the money available to do the things that you should be doing in terms of improving welfare. On the other hand, we have many ideas in region, okay, like hiring an extra Anganwadi worker hiring 1 million Anganwadi workers tomorrow would be one of the easiest ways, right, to improve both equity and efficiency, because like I've already said, it has a return on investment of 12 to 20 times the cost, and it disproportionately benefits the poor who are using these Anganwadi services. Okay, so one of the key points in the book is to say a lot of India's public discourse ends up being on the zero-sum debate of should we do this or this, but there are many areas where you can do win-win reforms that improve both equity and efficiency. So while we may disagree about R2 versus R4, we should be able to build a national consensus to identify items in region 3 and slowly kind of, even if politically it is difficult to cut that spending, at least to limit the growth of that spending so that you're saving money to be able to invest in R1 ideas, okay, that can increase both equity and efficiency. Okay. Similarly, in revenue, this is a place where, again, we have challenges on both the quantity and quality of revenue. So our tax to GDP ratio is around half of OECD countries. But more importantly is what Dr. Ajay Shah and Vijay Kelkar have estimated is that because many aspects of our revenue collection are relatively inefficient, that the marginal cost of public funds in India is about 2.5 to 3. So what that means is for every 1 rupee of tax revenue that we raise, the true economic cost is another 1.5 to 2 rupees because of the distortions created in the economy compared to, say, 1.3 to 1.7 in other high income countries. Now, again, this is a function of formalization, because when you're richer and more formal, it becomes easier to collect your taxes. But the larger point here is the reason the revenue piece is important is when you have sectoral advocates, for example, education. Sectoral advocates will say we need to spend 6% of GDP on education, okay? But that norm comes from an OECD tax to GDP ratio of 35%, whereas in India, that's about half of that, okay? So relative to the budget, we are actually spending exactly what we should be spending. It's just that we don't have the money. And so the problem is sectoral advocates don't look at the overall fiscal envelope, right? Because once you look at that, you realize the importance of cost effectiveness, okay? And then federalism and decentralization. Again, this is a place where we have huge ways to go, okay? Where first principles of federalism would say that service delivery functions should be sitting with local government. But India is one of the most over-centralized countries in the world, okay? So one way to see this is the fraction of government spending that happens at the local government level. And even a country like China that we think about as highly decentralized, when it comes to public expenditure, is incredibly decentralized. Okay, so almost 50% of expenditure in China happens at the local government level. In India, that's about 3%. Okay, so, and countries like the US and Brazil are in the middle at about 25, 26%. And so there are historical, social, and political, cultural reasons for this, which I talk about in my chapter. But the key point here is that you can't get better accountability and service delivery if the accountability is happening to a distant state capital rather than to local communities that have been served. Okay, and similarly, when you look at employees, India has only about 10% of total public employees at the local level compared to over 60% in China and the US. Okay, and then the last point comes to kind of chapter talks about the state and the market, right? Which is one of the consequences of the weakness of public service delivery is a large scale exit to the private sector. So in education, about 50% of school enrollment in urban India is private, 30% in rural India is private. Okay. In health, 70% of primary care is by private providers. In security, over 3.5 times more people are employed in private security than in field police posts. Okay. So now, at one level, this is kind of a rational consequence of the underperformance of the state, that anybody who can afford to leave leaves to the private sector. But what it means for the government is that when you think about your role as a policymaker, that it is not enough to just think about the government system. You have to think about how to improve the overall ecosystem. Okay, so the government plays three distinct roles in service delivery. The government is a policymaker, a regulator, and a service provider. And the way you need to think about the private sector is different in each role. Okay. And if you can greatly increase public welfare if you can make markets work better and leverage private providers to better serve the poor. Okay, but both of these functions also require state capacity. So even to leverage the private sector, you need state capacity. Okay, so even for people who think that we can use the private sector more, there is no getting away from state capacity for regulation, procurement, and and compliance more generally. Okay, so now, like, why have I gone through all of this? It is because this, I argue, is the key to kind of accelerating India's development. And so chapter 10, which is a key conceptual chapter, which is what I'll talk about now, is basically taking this discourse back to the big picture debate on growth versus development. Okay, so and this has been perhaps for 50 years one of the great debates in global development and in India, and highlighting India's status in terms of world leading thinkers. This, in the Indian context, would be known as the Bhagavati Sen debate. Okay. And so, simply put, the x-axis here, what this picture shows is that higher income countries do better on every human development. Okay, whether it's life expectancy, infant mortality, measures of education, measures of crime, measures of of safety. So in every measure, okay, the richer countries and richer states do better. Okay, so the growth view is to say that if you focus on growth and get 2% faster growth every year for 20% for 20 years, then all these development outcomes will automatically take care of themselves. Okay, because you will move to the right of this graph and you will automatically get better human development. Okay, now in contrast, the development view basically says that, listen, the purpose of growth is not just GDP per capita. The purpose of growth is to enhance human capabilities and human potential. And that requires a special focus on areas like health and education. And that was what Amartya Sen has famously found, kind of called the capabilities approach to development. And this has been incredibly influential. And so what this picture shows is that if you look at countries like Vietnam or Sri Lanka or Bangladesh or even China, that they managed to do significantly better than what you would predict. Okay, like from this regression line. So one way of saying this is that the growth walas are focusing on the slope, saying higher income will get you higher development outcomes, whereas the development walas are focusing on the outliers. Okay, saying, listen, you don't have to wait to get rich, okay, to get developed. You can improve human development if you focus more on the social sector. Okay, and so one striking example says Sri Lanka versus the US, where in the year of COVID, even though the US has, because you see the US does below expectation, Sri Lanka does much better relative to income. So in the year of COVID, actually the US and Sri Lanka had comparable life expectancy, even though the US had 15 times higher GDP per capita. Okay, so this has been this great debate, and one level both sides are right. Okay, because clearly more growth helps more human development, and more human development helps more growth. Okay, so then what are we arguing about? And the argument ends up being really one of the direction of causality, and ends up being partly ideological. Okay, where the center right traditionally has focused on infrastructure and capex, and the center left has focused more on human development. Now, what is my point of departure in this book is to say that, listen, this debate is fine, but at one level both sides are right. Okay, so what it may be doing is distracting us from the fact that the much more important issue is not how much you're allocating to infrastructure or allocating to social sector. It is the fact that the quality of expenditure is really bad in both. Okay, so and it is not just the case that capex automatically means better quality of expenditure, because we have CAG report after report, which I talk about in the book, that talks about the time and the cost overruns of capital projects and the quality challenges that you have. And similarly, in the social sector, we have a whole bunch of these kind of delivery problems. So my point of departure in the book is to say that if you focus on improving state capacity and governance, you can do more of everything. Okay, so you don't have to choose between growth and development. If you focus on productivity, you can do more of everything. And this is in fact consistent with the macroeconomics literature on growth accounting across countries, where people look at how much of the variation in GDP per capita across countries can be explained by physical capital, how much by human capital, and how much by productivity. And the answer is that it's about 20% physical capital, 20% human capital, 60% is TFP or productivity. And part of my argument here is the same thing, that if we focus on the productivity of the state, that you can do more of everything. And that's why this becomes the most important thing for us to focus on. So now, what is one reason for optimism? Okay, one reason for optimism is that if you look at global development in the 20th century, one of the great triumphs has been what is called shifting of the Preston curve, okay, which is what is this showing? Is the x-axis is GDP per capita, and this guy is showing life expectancy in 1930. And you see 1960, this whole curve had shifted up, and then in 1990, 2015, it's continued shifting up, okay? So what this is showing is that over time, countries are able to achieve better human development outcomes even at the same level of income as poorer countries, okay, as richer countries. And so the main reason for this is that when you have better technologies and better data and new innovations, you are able to kind of achieve better outcomes even at a lower income. So the best example of this, say in the case of health, is exactly 100 years ago in 1924, even the president of the US, the son of the president of the US could not save his son from a simple bacterial infection, okay, because we didn't have any antibiotics or penicillin. But 100 years later, even a poor daily wage laborer can kind of save himself from such a infection because you have these medicines available, okay? So the similar question when you think about governance and development more broadly is, what do we have today that today's rich countries did not have at the same level of historic GDP per capita? And what we have is we have much better data and evidence on the quality of expenditure. So particularly in the last 20 years, because of the explosion of computing power and access to data, we have such better research and insights on how to improve effectiveness of public spending, and we have much better technology that we can deploy for this, okay? And so this is where we have a free lunch, and the free lunch, therefore, we have enormous opportunities to improve and spending quality and accelerate development, because we have many very expensive policies and programs that have no impact, and we have other much less expensive interventions that are highly effective but are not being implemented because we don't have the money. And it highlights the importance of research for improving government spending, and that's because there is no market efficiency test, okay? So in the private sector, I don't worry about whether companies are producing efficiently, because if they're not, they'll go out of business, so they face competitive pressure, okay? Whereas governments can spend taxpayer money badly for a really long time, and so that magnifies the importance of the research in guiding government spending, okay? Now, I'm going to skip that example in the interest of time, all right? Now, why does this matter? So, what I show in chapter 10 is talking about, like, where can we expect to be in 2047 in terms of the projections. So if you just look at the last 10 to 15 years, or in some cases we have data for 20 years, but if you look at the translation of how GDP per capita growth has translated to human development, and look at key outcomes, okay, look at stunting. So our stunting rate today is about 35%. So even if you continue a growth rate of 6% annual GDP per capita, which is about 7%, without adjusting for population, if you just extrapolate from the past 20 years, you'll see that in 2047, we will still have a 25% stunting rate, okay? And that's a staggeringly high number. Now, even if you manage to get growth to 8%, you're looking at about 22% stunting, okay? But if you manage to double the effectiveness of government spending going forward, then even at 6, double the translation of income growth into outcomes, even at 6%, you can take this 25% to 17%. And remember, if you manage to do this, you will also get a further tailwind to development, because the better human development will kind of feed back into growth. And if you manage to get 8%, then you can halve the stunting number to about 13%, okay? Similarly, in education, if you continue at the current rate, we will still have only 84% of children completing class 5 being able to read in 2047. If you manage to grow at 8%, that comes to, this is at 6%, at 8%, that becomes 2046. If you double the effectiveness going forward, then you bring it forward to 2038. And if that feeds into 8% growth, you bring it into 10 years from now, okay? Now, so this is why, this is such a big deal, because the welfare consequences of this are enormous, okay? So if you add the total number of children in under this curve, in the current projection, you will end up with 200 million more children who will complete class 5 without being able to read between now and 2047. And if you manage to kind of do these reforms that we talked about, you can halve that number and perhaps do even better, okay? And the reason I particularly focus on outcomes like stunting and child development is that many of these children are not yet born, okay? Which means that their future is completely in our hands. That gives us the capacity to actually, in the next 10 years, literally have a 0 to 10 mission, for child development that has these components of evidence-based ideas that are highly cost effective, and kind of overlay that with a governance set of governance reforms, and I think we can dramatically accelerate development. Okay, so let me stop there and just kind of give you a final synthesis and outline of the book itself, right? Which is we've got these technical core of kind of building an effective state, and then there's this policy core. Now, why do I focus on these 6 sectors of education and skills, health and nutrition, police and public safety, courts and justice, social protection and welfare, and jobs, productivity, and economic growth? And the reason for this is, again, going back to the great Bhagavati Sen debate, because of growth and development. By focusing on these sectors, we don't have to choose, okay? Because every one of these sectors is intrinsically important for human capabilities, okay? So we should care about education and health, even if it doesn't matter for productivity, because it helps people live more meaningful lives, okay? But it also helps productivity, right? So there's no trade-off. Similarly, with police and safety, that contributes to economic activity. So this is why a key focus in this book has not just been to say, here is a bunch of research ideas, but recognizing that, that we often have kind of highly polarized debates. So I'm spending a lot of effort focusing on how can we identify a set of areas where we can build a broad consensus, okay, across the left, across the right, across, all ideologies, to say that, listen, whether you care about growth or development, inclusion or growth, this is an agenda that is kind of central to accelerating India's development. And then the last 2 chapters then go back to kind of, thinking about the broader social kind of milieu in which we are, and saying, how do we reimagine institutions so that this kind of approach of improving the quality of governance is not just a one-off that is led by an individual officer or individual politician, but how do you reimagine institutions so that the entire government starts working better on an ongoing basis? And then the final part is, what role do kind of after reading this whole book, what role do different actors as citizens in society have in kind of contributing to this mission of accelerating growth? So again, I deeply regret not being able to do this in person, because there's a certain additional kind of connection that happens from that. But let me stop here and look forward to reactions and questions for the next half an hour.
Absolutely fabulous, Karthik. You have given a bird's eye view of the whole book. I had started to read it and glimpse through it, but you really set the context so beautifully. We are open to questions, and I would request you to raise your hand if anyone has a question. Yes, there's a question from Dr. Ashok Vishandas, and that will be followed up with a question from Professor Shafi and then Kanish Shetty. Dr.
Yes,
Vishandas.
yes. Thank you, Professor Karthik. Am I audible? Yes, Professor Karthik. It was a wonderful and masterful exposition. I don't claim that I have read fully, but I read some of the very hurriedly few chapters, and first reading a few, because it runs into more than 750 pages around that time. That number is in excess of 700. I read it carefully. Now, one thing which really I'm surprised, you in the chapter 18, you discuss about the three elite groups. One of them is the government employees, large landholders, and the big businesses. And of course, I don't know much about the two, but I myself superannuated as a secretary to Government of India. I really don't consider myself and my many known friends as a elite group. So to me, it was a one surprise, which is not related to the empirics. Maybe you talk to few, but it's not a representative sample that I feel that way, because I have seen the other side of the thing. And one thing, you talked about the class conflict to collective action also in the chapter 18, and that is one. And another thing, you compared in some sense India with the Botswana, and Botswana is the only country after the World War II who has registered the growth rate in excess of India's and has been fully democratic and things like that. Other countries who have performed better are not fully democratic. So those things. But Botswana, as you yourself had mentioned, its population is less than 2% of India's. So to in that extent, in that country, it's not compared. So these are the few things. I must tell you that I am enriched by the insights you have given, but on certain things I'm struck also. So maybe your thoughts on that, over to you.
Yeah, let me respond. Can you hear me?
Yes, yeah, sure.
Yeah. So super quickly, like, I think the yeah. So so this point about the elites, right? I think there's a subtle point. So in fact, this is not my terminology. This actually came from Professor Pranab Bardhan, like, in 1984. He's got this classic book on the political economy of India, of Indian development, and so he identifies these three groups. Now, you are right when you say that when we think about the true, see, elite is all relative, correct? Like, so from our perspective of upper middle class kind of educated folks, the true elites are kind of the the industrialists, okay? Like, but from the perspective of the average population, right, like, the government employees are in fact, like, an elite, right? Because everybody aspires to be a government employee, right? So the point there is more along the lines of saying that coming to this point of state capacity, that we don't have enough employees, okay? So there is, in fact, NC Saxena, right? NC Saxena, who's a distinguished former IAS officer, when he wrote this book on why the IAS fails, in fact, he has written something like saying that in many ways the system seems to appear to mainly exist to serve itself, okay? So he's been even more critical. I am not being so critical. I'm just saying that, listen, when we look at where the distribution of public resources are going, the salaries, and see, and the other thing that is important is at the secretary level, at the top levels, like I said, because of the wage compression, the top officers in the government are paid less than what that talent will command in the private sector, okay? But for the bottom 95 to 98% of government employees, that you are paid much, much more, okay? So the point about the government employees being an elite group that has kind of captured resources for itself is reflected in the public sector pay being higher than any other country in the world on a just relative to GDP, okay? So that's where that is coming from. And then I think, yeah, so this point about Botswana, so which is why I keep saying in India, if in chapter 10, that's why I keep saying I'm very positive in India, very optimistic, right? Because in many ways, relative to the scale of our challenges, we have done incredibly well, okay? So which is why, as a good professor, like, my grade for any student is always can do better, right? Like, I mean, so the whole point is we've done, and again, this is not just me, right? Like, this is even Dr. Ashok Lahiri, right? So Ashok Lahiri, former CA, had this recent big book on, on India, and even he says that India has done good but not great, right? Like, so which means there is potential to get better, and that's what this is about, right? So
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Yes.
Sir,
Yeah, but I would also like to add just one sentence.
Yeah.
See, in the elite, though you have not mentioned very explicitly, but some people like you mentioned about NC Saksena's book, which I have read thoroughly because he had been my boss. I have worked under him in rural development. So I know him personally also, and I read his book, Why IS Fail. Now, the question is, he is assuming, and many others assume, within the government class, there are people who just live on the fair means what the government provides, and there are large number who go overboard and then uncertain because they are in a position. Every government servant is in a position to earn unearned money. Now, if you account for that, I can agree that is in elite group, but not who are going strictly by the rules book and living on their entitlement and on what is given them directly. So to me, that perhaps distinction, perhaps I mean, many authors shy away from making that distinction, but I assume that in the back of their mind, and therefore they say it's elite group. Otherwise, they are not elite group because I have lived my own whole life on that. Okay.
correct.
Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah.
sir,
Yeah.
I am Sivaram, sir, lecturer in economics from
Sivaram,
Andhra
Sivaram,
Pradesh.
just a second. I'm following a certain sequence. So I'll flag you. You raise your hand because even Professor Narendra Pani is there. and then Dheeraj Adich is there. So let me follow a sequence. And Sivaram, I'll call you when your sequence comes. Now, I had requested, there were two more names earlier who had raised their hand. Okay, if they don't want to ask, let me go to Professor Narendra Pani, and then we will go to Ganesh Shetty. Yep. You are muted, Professor Pani.
Right. Thank you for that very detailed picture of what of specific aspects of what's happening in India. But one issue that keeps coming up when I see your work, and I've been following your work for many years, is that is there sufficient emphasis given to the context in which these figures emerge? Botswana, India, these are all things that are catchy and useful in many ways, just to tell us where we are and we don't get too ahead of ourselves. But the fact is that you have very fundamentally different contexts, particularly when you look at the Indian case, because we are going through millions of workers moving out of agriculture into non-agriculture. This is a process that has led to huge amounts, and you're moving out of a land-intensive economy, which has led to huge social conflict across the world, from the wiping out of the native Indian in the US to the Industrial Revolution, and or through collectivization, etc. Now, when you leave that out, we tend to misinterpret what the state is doing. Because if you are in the midst of the transformation, it's all very well to say that we are a democracy and we are doing very well because of it. But one of the instruments in a democracy is to meet local interests immediately. Right? And that is, in many senses, what you're seeing as the inefficiency of the state. The option of waiting for an efficient outcome doesn't quite arise. You see, you're really looking at what you need to do. The governments have been doing that. When you're dealing with, even if you look around the current narrative, the issue people say is, why are you having 80 crore people being given free food if we are such a successful economy? I really think whether the context would change your arguments is what I would like to.
Yeah, no, so I think, no, see, there's no question that contexts vary, right? I mean, and the challenge of any social science study is to kind of, so, there's an extreme that is, at one level, you can do an ethnographic study of just one village and saying, I understand this village well, but it may not apply somewhere else. So all research in that way is an exercise in judgment about being true to the context and trying to extract what you think are the most general principles that come out of that, right? I mean, so that way, I think the one thing I feel comfortable about in this book is that almost all of the research is from India, almost like, across 20 states, over the years, right? So, and it reflects kind of really detailed, not just field work, but also kind of work at the mid-level of the government itself, right? I mean, kind of the ethnography of the state, so to speak, right? Which sometimes is something, so anthropologists have done some work on that, but economists have, I don't think, done enough work on that. This is the point. So listen, all research in some sense is kind of a part of an ongoing conversation of helping to kind of understand. And this is my attempt to synthesize what I feel that we are learning from about the last 20 years of really high quality work on the translation of programs into impact, right? So I think that's the main thing that is new in kind of this body of work, right? Which is, there's been a lot of work that will, I mean, there's no shortage of high quality research, right? But I think what I'm trying to do here is illustrate that so much of our policy conversations happen at a sectoral level, but I'm trying to illustrate that the common binding constraints are in fact are there in every sector, and these have to do with the machinery of the state itself, and this is not something that we're paying enough attention to. Okay, and the argument therefore is that paying that attention to what is broadly called administrative reform, but it's not just administrative reform, it really is deeply strengthening systems of governance, and the chapters then give you evidence-based ideas for how to do that. Now, in the end, in a democracy like India, we all have just, we have one voice, we put it out there, and the idea is to put a menu so that different people may be able to pick different ideas that work in their settings and context, and to therefore contribute to this larger development process.
Thank you. Thank you. Let's go to Shetty, Dr. Shetty.
Hello. Good evening, sir. Good evening, gentlemen. Charan sir, I just wanted to point out that I'm just an economics postgraduate from the University of Mumbai, but I do plan to pursue my doctoral studies going
All
ahead.
right.
First,
Welcome.
yes. So,
Let's have your
Karthik,
question.
yes, sir. Yes, sir. So, first off, Karthik, sir, it's very impressive how you try to bring balance to the Bhagavati Sen debate by emphasizing how growth and development should go hand in hand. And it is indeed very important from the point of view of building human capital that there's improved, better training facilities that can impart new skills to the labor force in India that can prepare it for the upcoming technological challenges. Now, sir, you yourself are a Tata's chancellor, professor. There's this very impressive thing that Tata has done is that it has incorporated the social welfare ethic into its objective of profit maximization. So how can the state today nudge the private companies in India, the business elites, to incorporate that same social welfare ethic into their broader goals of profit maximization?
Yeah, so I think,
Karthik, I suggest, Karthik, let's take 2 or 3
we'll
questions
take,
together.
sure,
Because otherwise we'll run badly out of time. Okay,
definitely.
can I invite Dr. Nagesha? Dr. Nagesha?
Sir. Sir,
Yeah.
good evening, sir. Good evening, Karthik Muralidharan, sir. It's a very wonderful presentation and the ideas, so the presentation was very insightful. Sir, I have one small clarification from your side. There are many teachers and not exclusively on teachers, the employees in the private sector who has been paid, they are either contractual basis or informal worker where we are planning when the informal sector is, if we formalize it, so on the entire growth will stuck onto, so what we are planning 7% or 8%, it may come down to much lesser because of the amount of salaries which go up and the other stuff. And some of the study which you have quoted, the so below less lower cadres, across all the sectors, the salaries are much higher compared to the private sector. But that it's not possible to compare my observation, but I seek your inputs. So where the employees are contractual basis or in an informal sector, is it, can you expand that? And I need some inputs on that, sir. And some your experiences on social sector, how can we increase our productivity, particularly with respect to social sector, that to education and health, by government measures, that too through human resources which you have pointed out. We need, we can improve the physical infrastructure, but where that the entire technology will take care, but with respect to how to improve the quality with respect to human intervention. Thank you, sir.
Let's have Dr. T. Sadashivam. Yeah. Dr.
Hello.
T. Sadashivam.
Yeah, am I audible, sir?
Yep.
Okay, so first of all, I would like to congratulate Professor Karthik for a wonderful presentation. Sir, I have, of course, I'm not an economist. I'm from public administration background. So like the crux which I got from your presentation is that how to, in India, the problem is about the state capacity. So my simple question is with you, how we can improve the state capacity, especially if you see, we had 2 administrative reform commission. And even then, now in the last 10 years, we are adopting more technology, like you already said in your presentation about DBT and all. But even then, we cannot improve the state capacity. So what can be the solution for improving the state capacity? This is one question. And second question, which is related with that, is that I don't know your book. I have not read your book and I would like to read. Did you have noted anything about the, the difference between the North and the Southern states in terms of, the governance aspect? And the capacity of the governance system in the South and the North. Did you mention anything about in your book? So these are the 2 questions, sir. I would like to hear from you. Thank you.
Karthik, before you respond, we'll take 2 more questions. One is from Dheeraj Dadij and one is from Matthew, Professor Matthew Kurian. So Dheeraj, why don't you go ahead, and then we'll have from Matthew Kurian, and then we'll stop at that round and we'll go back to Karthik. Dheeraj?
I'm not sure if you are going to remember all these questions, but let me take a shot anyway. The thing is that when somebody looks at the suggestions that you are making, somebody not from economics is thinking, okay, this is very much of a common sense. So why does it take you 20 years of education to bang your heads against so many research to arrive at a conclusion that somebody at a village level would have come up? Okay, if you incentivize people to do something, they do it more efficiently. I mean, are economists themselves the roadblock to the growth and development? I mean, and second question I had, sorry, Charanji.
No, no,
Second
Dheeraj, I
question I
totally
had.
agree with you. Means, why do you have to go to Harvard to study all this? I agree with you. I think I've wasted my life also. So Murli has also wasted his life. I totally agree with you. These things are so well known. Under a tree, the cycle repair man also knows all this. And now at my age, I feel I've wasted all my life. So go ahead with your second question.
The second question was this only. I mean, see, you said in the starting of the presentation that you did the historical and the political science based analysis, and the most prevailing sort of political system has been feudalism and let's say some sort of a monarchy, which has been always, due to the technical nature of those times, had been decentralized by design. So when we need to, let's say, make a case using data and correlations, um, are we still playing in that frame where centralization has happened and some big committee of Politburo is going to distribute the resources and all? So why not go even deeper into the political science and study maybe, let's say, feudalism or monarchy, or how economics is let's say a study of actually how humans operate over a period of time, rather than the small period of time where we can accumulate a lot of data and make the correlation and that sort of, if that makes sense. Thank you.
Sure. Let's have the last question in this round from Professor Matthew Kurian.
Thank you, Professor Muralidharan, for your lucid presentation of a great concern of all of us, the question of social and economic inclusion in India. However, I have two queries which I fear it may be beyond your book. One is the complex international political economic situation of today. How we have to take into account this. And the to us. All these are there. So, what may be the implication of that to us? One of the questions. The second question may be a critical question. Nowadays, when we argue for democracy, there is also the
Is he frozen?
Sir,
I can't hear.
Yeah. Kurianji, we can't hear you.
Sir.
Can you hear?
Yeah, now
Can
we
you
can
hear?
hear. Yeah.
The second question is, first question, I hope you got it. International political. The second question is, when we claim that we are in a democracy, we are unfortunately placed in crony capitalism also. So how we have to tackle this dilemma? These are the two questions. Thank you very much.
Sir,
Karthik, we'll
Sivaram,
go
sir.
for the second round after this. There are some more questions, but if you can answer and if you want to answer some of these questions.
Yeah, so let me, if you can hear me, I think I managed to write down all the questions. Hopefully I will not, can you see me?
Yep.
Yeah, because it's freezing a bit. Okay, yeah, so I think the first question based on the Tata's example was how to bring ethics into business activity and behavior. So I think, see, there's an optimistic part of this, which is seeing that the number of kind of companies, partly the CSR Act was an attempt to do this, right? It was an attempt to kind of get companies to at least apply their mind to aspects of social responsibility. So, see, the honest truth is you can't force charity, you can't force kind of people to do what they don't want to do, but I think you can nudge them along the ways of the examples, right? And so the reason I'm optimistic is I am starting to see a really broad swathe of increase in kind of interest in philanthropy. Now, the cynical part of this is that, people make their money in unethical ways and then like to kind of, create foundations to give themselves a good name. Okay. So frankly, if you're a business person, I would much rather, more than philanthropy, I would rather you do ethical business practices. Okay. So you make your money in ethical ways before you kind of try to make money in unethical ways and then launder your name by giving money somewhere else. Okay, so I think the first foundation of that is just ethical business itself. Okay, and I think the good news again is that there are clearly people who intrinsically value that, but you need a combination of the nudges in terms of what does society value and recognize, and a combination of the right kind of legal and regulatory instruments to take action against unethical behavior. Okay, so and all I will say is even that requires state capacity. So again, when I say state capacity is the binding constraint to everything, right? It is exactly that we have regulatory needs. Even when the private sector is kind of doing the provision, you need high quality regulation, which we often don't have the capacity for. I think there was a question from Professor Nagesh on kind of contractual employment, right? In government. And I think so. This is why I hope what this talk does is gives people a little bit of a flavor and appetizer and motivation to read the book. Okay. I think the book, if I may say so, is very, very careful about each of these points and kind of comes up with balanced approaches. Okay. So today, if you think about government employment, the problem is at one level, you have contractual employees, who often have no benefits, no, it's a pure short-term contract is kind of unfair to the employee. On the other hand, a lifetime contract is unfair to the taxpayer, because what you get with the lifetime contract is you have very little accountability, very little incentives for upgrading skills, and essentially there is a whole bunch of documentation in the book about how lifetime employment may be kind of suboptimal right now, at least not for all jobs, but for many jobs. Okay, so we need to find nuanced balances. And one of the things I've talked about there, for example, is, in our UPSC, one simple idea which I have in the book, which multiple people have appreciated, is to say our UPSC selection process is a very high integrity process. It is wonderful. Okay, but less than 0.1% of candidates get selected. Okay, so if you think about the total waste of human resources that's happening there, for every one candidate who's selected, we spend over 1,000 person years of time. Okay, now the problem is, on the other hand, the government is desperately short-staffed. Okay, so in every government department you go to in the center of the states, it'll be running around with consultants. Okay, and the consultants and young fellows are the people who are actually doing the work. Okay, and this is again highlights the challenge of state capacity. So one of the ideas I proposed is saying, why can't we use the UPSC process to empanel the top 1%? Okay, so the top 0.1% might still be the ones who are getting selected, but you can take the top 1% and create an empanel list where you offer a 3-month foundation course, and after that, people on the empanel list can be appointed on 3 to 5 year contracts by any state government or central government or government agency, because you've been through a UPSC process. So there are ways to kind of balance the needs of kind of objectivity in the selection that comes from the exam process with a certain amount of accountability and incentives for skills that comes from, say, 3 to 5 year renewable contracts. And there's a way to balance these things. But again, I'll encourage you to read the book. I think the next question, I'm sorry, in some ways, the question of how can we improve state capacity is that is why the whole book exists. Okay, so I can't give you that answer in 1 minute. All I can say is, I promise you, if you read the reviews of the book, see, one thing I've worked very, very hard on this book is that however deep the academic research might be, I have worked very hard to simplify the writing. Okay, so the writing is very, very, very accessible even to non-researchers, non-technical folks. Any college student in any subject should be able to read and assimilate kind of the book. So I strongly encourage you to pick that up. Now, differences between North and South, yes, absolutely. I discuss some of this, but I don't get into the deeper historical reasons, because these differences reflect a combination of history, geography, politics, culture. And so, but what I do talk about is what are the things that are working in some of the better governed states that can be learned from. But at the same time, we also have innovations in kind of, lower income states that are also worth replicating. So one of the subtitle of the book, which I've not had a chance to emphasize, is called a state level roadmap. Okay. So most of my focus is actually on state government led issues and not central government. And that's because most of the issues of education or health or service delivery are constitutionally with the state government. Okay. So, and most of our policy discourse in India focuses on Delhi, whereas states are bigger than most countries, right? The 15 largest Indian states would all be in the top 20 countries in the world by population. And so we really need to kind of think about more localized, customized solutions at the state level and encourage state level thought leaders to kind of take greater ownership, right? I mean, for the reform trajectories of their own states. And that way, state-led innovation can really catalyze what prime ministers historically called, competitive and cooperative federalism. So you do get states to want to innovate on different margins, and for states to quickly copy then what is effective. So I think that's a key source of, accelerating India's development. I think Dheeraj, you've got this interesting question about this is common sense. Why do you need the research to show it? It is okay. It is a deep question in the sense that now maybe it feels that way because I'm simplifying the messages in ways that are abstracting from the technicalities of the research. But you're also right. Okay. Now, but let me give you one example of how this is a little nuanced and why you might need the research. Okay. So when we say that. So, for example, okay, we have a civil service recruitment process that is based on a very, very high stakes entrance exam, okay? And there is reasonable uncertainty, both theoretically and practically, about is this a good form of public sector recruitment, okay? And you can make arguments both ways. And the reason you often need the research in individual cases is to very, very carefully think about the pros and cons of different ideas, and then kind of look at, okay, despite all of this, is it working, okay? Now, but sometimes you're right. Sometimes you're right that it is common sense. And the challenge is because a government is used to behaving in a certain way for a very long time, then, things that are common sense are often not done. I mean, so something as simple as absence, okay? It should be common sense to say that like you should take action if somebody is absent 25% of the time, but it doesn't happen, okay? So then the value of the research and the value of the papers and the books is to document in the public domain, to start a conversation about what needs to happen, because in a private company is very, very different from the government, okay? So that's, I think, one of the other reasons why you need the research. But yeah, my hope is that when you read it, and it's 800 pages, but the book is 600 pages with 200 pages of notes and references, that when you go see individual papers, you'll kind of appreciate, like why specific questions still needed research. And what a book like this does is take kind of the best insights from a whole bunch of research over 20 years to synthesize that, okay? I think the question about international political economy, right? Like, wars and pandemics. Sorry. And then Dheeraj, you have the second question about, are we playing in a frame of over-centralization? That I completely agree with you. So which is why one of the points of chapter chapter 8 in federalism is precisely to kind of go back to first principles of how does the size of a polity, right, which is the size of the unit of governance, affect the quality of governance. And there are very kind of important principles there. So I strongly encourage you to read that, and hopefully you'll find some value there from the research and kind of the theoretical frameworks of thinking about optimal size of government. Okay. So again, let me give you a simple example. There are some aspects of governance that should be done at a decentralized level. There are other aspects that require coordination and need to happen at a higher level. So it requires a very nuanced kind of breaking down of tasks. Okay. So even the 7th schedule of the Constitution does this in a relatively kind of crude way, because it's saying, okay, here are sectors that are in the state and in the central list and in the concurrent list. But in practice, you'll see that the first principles of federalism will say that if you have economies of scale and if you need to coordinate, then those functions should sit at a higher level of government. But if you need to accommodate variation in people's preferences, variation in needs, and kind of shorten the information cycle between hearing from citizens and acting on it, then those functions need to sit at a local government level. Okay. So, and part of the value of the chapter is just having this conceptual clarity and then mapping it to how we are functioning in government and demonstrating that we are in fact highly over-centralized. Okay. So I think you're exactly right on that. And then I think question from Matthew Kurian on the complex international political economy, right? I think, see, there's no question that these things matter, but let me use a term from sociology here, okay, which is, so sociologists use this idea of what they call structure and agency, okay, to determine how we need to act in the case of outcomes, right? So we are all individual agents acting within broader structures that are both kind of, local, national, global structures. But within those structures, we each have agency about what are the things that are in our control. Okay, so similarly, if you're a state government or a municipal government or municipal, mayor or municipal commissioner in a tier 2 city in India, you can't affect what is happening with the Ukraine war or the pandemic, but you can affect kind of the quality of service delivery in your setting. So there is still an enormous amount that is in our control that we should be kind of acting on. Okay, now we can pontificate. Now, if I'm a foreign relations expert and there are people in the government whose job it is to pontificate on the strategic implications of global affairs for India, but for a very large number of people, that is not their job, and there are many things in their job that they should be doing that will improve outcomes. And I think this larger point about we claim we're a democracy, but how we are also kind of in a world of crony capitalism, and how do you deal with this? I think, the bad news is that this is not a problem that is unique to India. Okay, so this is a global problem. And one of the things I talk about in the book is this core tension, right, between, the democratic ideal that is one person, one vote. Okay, whereas what ends up happening in practice is we often function on a 1 rupee, 1 vote principle. Okay, and we see that recently with, say, justice issues. Okay, like of people committing crimes from high incomes who can kind of, get away with impunity. So these are deeper structural problems that will require kind of a combination of social outrage and conversation that will create our own reform. Now, to be optimistic, what I'm going to say is, if you look at the US in the 1850s, okay, many aspects of politics would look as corrupt, as kind of, captured and as beyond redemption as we might think. But over time, the combination of education and information, I think, are the biggest kind of, sources for optimism, because the way you change what you get in the politics is by changing what the citizens are asking for. And on that, education and information are going to be our best long-term allies.
Okay, I think there was some Sushant, as I read it, who wanted to ask a question.
Sivaram,
I think we passed time, right?
Sivaram.
Anyway, so I'll take 2 quick questions
Yes,
and then I will have to run.
yeah.
But thank you. Yeah.
We'll
Sivaram,
take
sir.
one more question.
Sivaram, sir.
Sivaram, you have a question? Can you be kindly brief? We have already exceeded our time.
So, sir, I have some serious objections on what you have said about these aspects like GST and also this free electricity and also the percentage of allocation to education and also health, because health and education need more and more allocations, but in India the allocations are very much less. Even though there may be inefficiency, but we should improve the allocations. Then only there will be possibility for improving health and education. Delivery alone doesn't make improvement. It should be more and more expenditure should be spent on health and education, and even free electricity. Free electricity doesn't cost much. In Andhra Pradesh in 1990 itself, Chandrababu Naidu introduced reforms in state electricity board. He restructured the electricity board and improved efficiency. But improvement and efficiency will improve the electricity availability and all those things. But giving 350 crores around to farmers doesn't mean burden to the exchequer of state government or so. And
Sivaram, you've made your point.
Yeah, no, so I think this is important enough. Let me respond. I think, see, these are both excellent points, okay? And I think I want to clarify 2 important things, okay? So, in fact, I am not arguing, I'm not making the claim. Yeah, sorry, can you hear me?
Even GST also, sir. GST it is major source of revenue for the government. Without even some of the people are evading taxes. In this manner, they come under for tax purview if we impose tax, but it may be reduced. The slabs may be reduced, but GST it should be even though it is regressive, it is the major source of revenue to the government. So it should be it should not be criticized on the basis of efficiency or something else, sir.
Correct. Yeah, no, so in fact, no, thank you for those questions, because I think, see, I agree with all three of your points. So maybe I was unclear, and maybe again, it highlights the need for actually reading the book, okay? Because all of this is discussed in much greater detail. See, on education and health, I say very clearly that we, in fact, do need more spending, okay? But my main point is that it is not a business as usual spending, okay? Because if you simply increase the budget, okay, without paying attention to where the budget is going, then most of that budget goes to items that are highly ineffective. That is my point, okay? I'm not saying don't spend the money. I'm not saying just focus on inefficiency. I'm saying identify the interventions that are going to improve both equity and efficiency, and then spend on those, okay? So for example, in education and health, that one of the points the research shows is that see, the activists have been asking for 20 years. Child rights activists have been saying that we need to strengthen the Anganwadi system, like, you know, with more with an extra worker, because this poor woman is literally like the Rukmini Banerjee calls the Anganwadi worker the Ma Durga of the childcare system, because she's got some 14 different responsibilities, and this one person is handling that, okay? So one of my basic, like, simple recommendations is saying, you know, so hiring an extra Anganwadi worker is an increase in spending in the social sector, right? Like, you know, so it is health and education, because like the research shows, it improves learning outcomes and reduces stunting, okay? So I'm completely in favor of expanding spending in the social sector. My only caveat is that if you look at how budget processes work within governments, and this is why you really have to read the book, right? Because the way budget works inside the government is every department comes and asks for their annual increment, and there is a mindless increase in the budget that just simply goes to expanding spending on existing categories, okay? That is what I am calling attention to, okay? So that's, I think, important. Second, on the subsidies, again, I am not in any way saying that we should not support farmers. What I'm saying is that for the same amount of fiscal outlay, okay, there are much more economically, and it is not just efficiency of electricity, okay? The efficiency point here is more one of how are we using our scarce factors of production, okay? So for example, I mean, Punjab has no business growing rice, okay? Like, I mean, the only reason you grow rice in a place that is, you know, like, is because the free electricity gets you kind of drawing out the groundwater, and you've got a groundwater crisis, you've got a crop diversification crisis, and you've got a pollution crisis because of this paddy stubble burning, okay? So the point is that the subsidy structure has a whole bunch of downstream consequences that massively increase inefficiencies in ways that we don't observe. So my point is that you can protect farmers with similar, the 350 crores is not my problem. My problem is how is that 350 crores being given, and that same 350 crores can be spent in ways that are much more effective at improving both effectiveness and equity and efficiency. So that's the point. And on GST, yeah, I don't think I said anything negative about GST at all. In fact, I'm a big supporter of GST. I was just using the example of rationalizing GST as an example of a policy that some progressive people oppose because it improves efficiency at the cost of equity. But I say exactly what you say, okay, which is that you have to look at taxing and spending as a portfolio, and improving GST efficiency will actually help development by providing the revenues needed for these other investments we're talking about. So I actually agree with everything you said. So please pick up the book and read it. That is my, you know, biggest kind of entreaty to everyone, you know, at the end of this talk.
Karthik, just a quick question from Susant. Dr. Susant, are you around?
I'm this. Yes.
Yeah, Dr. Susant.
Thank you. Thank
Okay,
you.
but be
It's
brief
a
and
nice
quick, please.
presentation, and you have given, yes, you have given very clear narratives regarding the Indian states and its development now. Sir, my question is that since you have raised the concept of decentralization and federalism, in this context, I would like to ask you, or I need some input from you, that how the federal development, without recognizing the regional identity, it will bring development within Indian states. Because when I visited the Andhra Pradesh, the Telangana regions, as well as the northern Karnataka part, there I studied, there I understood that people are not having that much scope or the resources. For example, when we are talking about the productivity will lead to the development and all. So there I got, there I didn't get anything which will promote development for the region as well as for the people. So they have many problems in those areas, particularly in northern Karnataka as well as in Telangana regions, where they are saying that we need many resources. I mean, government, the present government as well as the central government, they are not focusing any of the development for those reasons. So for which they have a very negative view. I mean, the discontent against the government, and they say that when we say federalism or federal development or democratic development, whatever the concept you may call it, but there is no development for us. For which the Telangana people, they started struggling since 1950s against the parent state Andhra Pradesh. Okay. The same case, if we study the Karnataka situation, there also we get the same situations where the northern Karnataka people, I mean the Hyderabad Karnataka region people, they started arguing that we are not getting any developmental assistance from the state government as well as the central government. So how will you see, or how will you give some kinds of inputs or suggestions for such kinds of issues? Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, so I think, so again, in the interest of time, what I'm going to do is just point you to the chapter. But the good news is what I'm saying is it's precisely because I recognize the centrality of this issue that I have a full chapter on federalism and decentralization and what are some of the principles by which we think about this. Okay. Now, the challenge is always federalism is a combination of politics and economics, right? So there are certain economic principles of federalism, and then there are political issues about in any region, even whether the same issue applies at a country level, at a state level, and even sometimes at a sub-regional level, that there will be some sections of that region that are more politically influential than others. And then there is always this risk about kind of resources being disproportionately allocated there. So that becomes more of a political issue than an economic issue. But as economists, I think we can focus on the first principles of saying, okay, what are the principles of effective federalism and effective kind of, what functions of government should sit at different levels. And this issue about how can we develop without resources. And that's exactly why kind of there's a distributive element to federal conversations. That is an inherently political conversation. And so, yeah, I don't, it's a very difficult issue, right? I don't think one can say generalizable things beyond kind of certain principles which are highlighted. I highlighted in the book, so I highly recommend that you read that.
All right, that should bring us to an
Thank you,
end
sir.
to a
Thank you.
very long session, very early morning for Karthik, my friend, and reasonably late for people in India. That's been a fascinating session. I must thank you, Karthik, for accepting our invite, and I must thank the participants for enriching it so much by asking such beautiful questions. So once again, thanks to you, Karthik, and thanks to the participants. Next week, we have, tomorrow by noon, this recording will be on our website. You're welcome to have this recording. And Karthik, I'll send you the link. I think this recording should go on Twitter because it is so rich a recording. And so many aspects have been covered so beautifully.
Thank you.
And I
Yeah,
think
my main goal is just to kind of, the book looks intimidating because it's 800 pages, but I promise you it's a very, very easy read. And, I think each chapter has enough content to be a book. So the good news is you don't have to read end to end. You can just pick up the intro chapter and then you can jump to whichever sectoral chapters. You can jump to health, jump to education, jump to tax, jump to federalism, and it'll all still make sense. So I strongly recommend it to you. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. And you're working with a team which is highly steeped in India. So I know the richness of that book is so good. And I glanced through a couple of chapters before inviting you to speak here, and I thought it was very impressive. Recording will be available tomorrow. I'm sure many people are going to be interested in this discussion as well as the book. So I wish you all the best. Next week, we have a great event coming up. We are going to be speaking about in our country. We are doing 2 workshops. EGROW is doing 2 workshops at IISc Delhi. And it's by invitation only. If you're interested, just write to me. It is in person and by invitation. We have 2-3 seats available for both the workshops. One is on 29th, Issues in the Indian Economy, and the other is on May 31, Friday, and that is on the issues of digital India. So if you are interested and you happen to be in Delhi, just let me know. We would be happy to accommodate 1 or 2 or 3 people at the max, because that's the capacity we have. We are next Friday, the webinar is on valuers, and we'll be happy to have you join us. It'll be around this time again because we are having people join us from Los Angeles, from New Zealand, from Boston, and from India, the speakers. So it'll be around this time and would welcome you all to be part of that discussion too. With that, let me wish you a great day, Karthik, and let me wish my friends in India a great evening and a great weekend, and look forward to all of you next week. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.